start this afternoon session. It's my really honor that I'm very pleased that I can announce the Professor Ludger Schwarte. Checking about the pronunciation, I'm so sorry because it's not perfect. You know, the professor from the University of Düsseldorf. As we've heard this morning, the title of his presentation is The Spaces of Reflection. Where does philosophy take place? You know, so it's very exciting. You know, it could be interpreted in two different ways. We will see. So please.
Many thanks.
Many senses, yeah.
But I wanted to say thank you to all of you, especially the organizers here, because for me it's very delightful to be. It's a surprising thing that this is possible, that this exists, because as Jörg has already mentioned, since a couple of years we are in a dialogue on these questions, but I had no idea that all of you exist. So that this has now some relevance for more and more people, and that actually you take for granted that such a thing as philosophy of architecture exists. I mean, it wasn't obvious for me when I started it, and so I'm very glad I can be here and discuss these things with you. As an introduction, Jörg and I were conversing about my possible presentation here. I will try out something new, which is more a linkage between the two fields, say, that we want to bridge here. Closer than what I've written so far. As you've heard, maybe I published a book called Philosophy of Architecture, a German philosophy architecture that was published by Fink in 2009, which is also an attempt to establish the topic itself, philosophy of architecture, bringing together the different approaches that existed, at least until then, the important authors and writings, to discuss them and to develop a proper idea, a proper stance within this field, which I will sketch at the end of this talk, which has 3 steps, which maybe you guessed from the abstract. As an introduction, I would like to say that philosophy of architecture, or what I do is philosophy of architecture. I think Jörg has the idea that there's something that is called architecture philosophy, and we have a debate about it, or an exchange about it. One could think about it in different terms. One that I quite like is to think of philosophy of architecture as something like a transdiscipline within philosophy that covers several areas, just as the 3 areas mentioned by Jörg this morning: anthropology, aesthetics, and epistemology. So it's not one thing extra to those, but something that goes across these, which I would call a transdiscipline. And in that sense, it is a bit like media philosophy, which also has branches or has applications to all these 3 or maybe other already well-established disciplines within philosophy. Just to give you a sketch of my approach, when I started to think of a philosophy of architecture, for me it was also an answer to media philosophy or media theory as it had developed with Kittler and others in Germany. My idea was that architecture is important to spell out sort of the material basis and infrastructure of medial conversations, of medial technologies that establish themselves on the basis of architecture. So my idea of the interest and importance and relevance of philosophy of architecture was to spell out how language, sign exchange, etc. is possible. And architecture is that which brings these infrastructures about. So it's also in part an answer to what has been dominating philosophy to a large extent in the 20th century, which is language philosophy, philosophy of language, and then media philosophy. But the philosophy of architecture is not only a transdiscipline, but in my view it is also a position, a specific approach to philosophical problems in general. And just to give you a sketch also where I stand there, architectural philosophy, as I would call it, goes, or gives an answer to, goes beyond constructivism, it goes beyond historical materialism, and it goes beyond post-structuralism. And architecture, the term architecture, is an answer to questions left open to these 3 approaches prominent within 20th century philosophy. How does it give an answer? Also there I give you a small sketch, which I will touch upon later. It takes, from my point of view, it takes environments as contingents. thereby meaning that also physical laws depend on architecture. And so environments are contingent means that, secondly, the specifics, the features of environments emerge in interaction. Interaction of human, non-human, so say material agents. And this then, thirdly, generates and invents affordances. The question I wanted to ask earlier to Jörg is, what about affordances? There was a question touched on when regarding technology, but also regarding subjects. It's how do we know what the door does? It doesn't, to my point of view, it doesn't derive from human needs. Rather, human needs, also the human physiology, only evolves within a given architecture, but this architecture is not once and for all humanity alike, but rather something historically contingent. And that's what makes architecture in broad sense important. So to sum up, what I consider philosophy of architecture is more general. It gives an answer to these questions and does not necessarily occupy itself with architects. So it is not dealing with the profession of architects and their teaching and their theory. It has a different agenda. So that's something I wanted to say, to just situate what I'm now trying to do. There is a long tradition in philosophy of linking reason and architectonics, German Architektonik, rooting in Aristotle's theory of action and the medieval idea that God is an architect. A notion which Immanuel Kant also uses in his lectures on metaphysics. Apparently it was Leibniz who suggested that humans imitate God, the architect, in their modifications on the earth, and that architecture is not a mechanical imitation on the workings of nature, but a definition of ends, Definition der Zwecke. On this track, Christian Wolff equalized the system of reason with the ground plan of the world, and Alexander Gottlieb Baumgarten, who you have mentioned already, sees architectonics, he uses already the term architectonic, as the systematicity of science. In his critique of pure reason, Immanuel Kant determined architectonics as the art of systems. That is, the capacity of reason to construct itself as a system, without which the manifold findings would remain a mere aggregation. He continues to write beyond the technical unity of sciences, which is produced by their schematic relation, that means the usage of the same concepts, methods, and instruments. The architectonic unity of science depends upon their deduction from a superior and their logic structure, which brings the multiplicity of knowledge into a unity of reason. What you see here is a schema by Ulfried Höffe, a renowned philosopher today within the Kantian tradition, who in a lexicon article on the critique of pure reason brings upon this as the schema of the architectonics in Kant. That's, according to Höffe, what Kant meant in Kant. In the quote I've just translated from Kant, there's this opposition of technical and architectonic. This opposition of technical and architectonic is revealing since it corresponds to the opposition of rationality and reason in Kant. To construct, which in German would mean Grund, to construct the unity of knowledge, not in a merely technical, but in an architectonic way, means, according to Kant, to sketch a schema which inheres the outline and the structure of the whole a priori, thus making integrity, das Ganze, possible. Architectonics, it follows from Kant, is necessary because the famous schema, which he then employs in his architecture, in his critique of pure reason, this famous schema, is not naturally given, but depends on a construction, self-construction, a foundation, Gründen, as he says literally in his text, which then means that the spontaneous self-construction of reason, postulating its correspondence and identity with natural order. In this tradition, one could speculate today whether the term architecture or architectonics, as the core of reason, as Kant sees it, is some sort of metaphorical import, synonymous with system or structure, or if the use of reason truly depends, as could be seen or interpreted in Kant, on an inner and cognitive architecture. This is a fancy philosophical question, but not mine. I would like to advance a more down-to-earth version of the philosophy of architecture. Today I would like to explore the affinity of philosophy of of philosophy and architecture with regards to the very concrete architectural dispositions of philosophy. It seems natural to believe that one can think, reflect, or do philosophy just anywhere. One might think of Diogenes in the tub, Diogenes in der Tonne. Or one might remember the anecdote retold by Hans Blumenberg in his book, The Laughter of the Thracian Woman, on the birth of theory. While focused on observing the stars, the early astronomer and proto-philosopher Thales of Miletus fails to see a well directly on his path and tumbles down. A Thracian servant girl laughs, amused that he sought to understand what was above him when he was not mindful of what was right in front of him. In both cases, however, imply architecture. The tub and the public square, in the case of Diogenes, a well and an open sky, in the case of Thales. Therefore, we should scrutinize the hypothesis that the way in which philosophy is practiced, institutionalized, and transmitted depends on architectures. One obvious reason is that the origin of philosophical teaching cannot be separated from certain architectural structures. It is already indicated by the fact that the philosophical schools in antiquity are indicated rather by the name of their locality than by the name of their masters, academics, peripatetics, storicists. Nevertheless, it would certainly be exaggerated to stipulate an intrinsic causal link between gymnasia and the philosophies that emerged out of them. This is a gymnasium I'm going to talk about. This could be sort of, analyzed as the origin of philosophy, the gymnasia in early essence. Certain aspects of the architectural structures are necessary for the provision of philosophic education, and other traits are typically emphasized as a choice, the orientation, and the address of the respective philosophical schools. I try to sketch this in a rather anecdotal way. Philosophy, it seems, evolved out of sports. In ancient Greek times, the gymnasium was the place for leisure, for physical and mental exercise. I just recall, for those of you who have maybe not thought of it, that gymnasium and gymnastics comes from the Greek term gymnos. Unfortunately, the Greeks seem to have forgotten this, but originally sport means nothing else than doing exercise while being naked. Gymnos means naked. And that's what they did here. They made exercises while being naked, and at the meantime, or in between, somewhere philosophy emerged. But this structure seems to be necessary, but more generally, what you have to keep in mind is what is the relation between architectural structures and what comes out there. I would suggest it's not a causal relation. It's not because you have a gymnasium that philosophy will emerge, but it doesn't go without either. So how do you relate architectural structure and social event? That's my basic question. The Greek youth who had reached the age of 18 were especially taught there. Beyond and after the physical and part military training, there must have been time to ask fundamental and awkward questions. The word school derives from ancient Greek skole, as maybe you know, which means leisure, free time, and idleness. The central space of the gymnasium was the palestra, a large central courtyard open to the sky, surrounded by roof colonnades, known also as peristyle. An area that was used for boxers, wrestlers, and pancratio. One gymnasium, the Academy, Academia, just northwest of Athens, of the city of Athens, was planted by beautiful trees. In the middle, a racetrack marked by sacred olive trees was surrounded by shaded walks. This is what you see today of Plato's Academy. Upon his return from Bari, mainly, from Magna Graecia in 387, Plato opened his school there, reserving a temple, sort of a sacred line called the Muses. Daily physical exercises and the gathering of troops forced Plato to transfer his teaching out of the academy into a garden which he owned nearby on Kolonos Hippios. Here you see a fancy painting from the 19th century. The Platonic Academy then formed the oldest and longest lasting institution of its kind in Greece. But why am I talking not of institutions and institutionalization of philosophy, but of architecture? The lessons were held there partly on Plato's side, partly on the public ground nearby in the Gymnasium Academios. Advanced students took on teaching and research tasks. The question as to whether and to what extent the knowledge transfer was formally organized and in which forms it took place is controversial today among scholars, in particular with regard to the role of the teaching lecture. The lesson was usually free, and the principle of equality of the learners obtained, which was unusual at the time. So social rank order based on ancestry and origin was lacking. There are even a number of documents attesting the presence of women students, something I didn't know before 2 weeks ago. Those women students at the academy. 2 pupils of Plato, who apparently were men's clothes, so they were butch students, and later also wrote books, were Axiothea of Laos and Lascinia of Mantinea. Such gymnasiae were preferably on beautiful surroundings and, if possible, near water. Several Platonic dialogues used the scenic charms of these idyllic circumstances for a lyrical frame. The trees, the shadows, and the trickling brook became a backdrop for strict philosophical reasoning. The school members understood themselves as a living community, which was expressed in common meals, symposia, and festivals. Herein, and in a strong emphasis on mathematics as a basic science, Pythagorean influence was evident. Plato rejected a dogmatic fixation of his doctrine. Individual teachings, which were opposed to those of Plato, could be represented at the academy. The teachers and learners, however, shared Plato's basic convictions. And if this was already the case, as in Aristotle, the student left the academy. The Lyceum was one of the favorite places of Socrates, who enjoyed watching gymnastics and palestres. This was also where he met his audience. In the dialogue Amphidemos, Plato paints Socrates sitting alone in the apodipterion, the change room, at the moment when 2 sophists enter the common promenade. Such descriptions allow us to assume that as early as the 5th century before Christ, the Lyceum consisted of a group of open constructions centered around a free space. Around the buildings, one must imagine a vast field where Lycurgus had made plantations, a canal which distributed fresh waters to all parts of the garden. It is probable that the painter Cleargus would have decorated the wall of the Lyceum with allegorical representations. In the footsteps of Socrates, several philosophers, including Protagoras, made it their center of instruction. Aristotle established his school there in 335, together with his friend Theophrastus. Because of their habit to wander around in the peripatos, a crowded hall, during discussion, Aristotle and his followers were called peripatetikoi. Socrates frequented the youth also in another gymnasium. This is Schule des Aristoteles, also 19th century imagination, of course. Here you see what's left of it today. Socrates frequented the youth also another gymnasium, the Snjezana. His disciple Antisthenes founded there the cynical school. So cynical comes from this garden, from this gymnasium called Kynosages. Diogenes was once his pupil too. Quite a few of his successors remained more faithful to the garden than to the lessons of his master. Another site is the Stoa, founded by Zenon of Citium. The Stoa Poikile, or painted porch, was erected during the 5th century before Christ and was located on the north side of the ancient Agora in Athens. The Stoa Poikile owed its fame to the paintings and to the loot from the walls displayed in it. The Stoa Poikile was the location where Zeno of Citium founded the philosophical school of Stoicism. Zeno taught and lectured to his followers from this porch, which had a Doric columnar facade and an Ionic interior colonnade. Here you see Zeno. That's the Stoa Poikile rendering from today. Well, always the question is this just random? Could it be anywhere, or is there some essential link between where it takes place and the kind of philosophy that emerges from there? Epicurus founded his school upon his return to Athens in 306 after the restoration of democracy. He bought a garden with a small villa somewhere in the Athenian suburbs and opened it to everyone willing to form a hedonistic community. Epicurus is said to have attracted 200 students. The school was named Hokepos, the garden. At the entrance, a sign read, "Stranger, here you do well to tarry. Here our highest good is pleasure." Guests were offered comfort, water, and bread. In contrast to the morals of his time, Epicurus accepted married couples, hetaeras, and slaves among his guests for the symposia and as students. Generally, one might say, the Gymnasia were public edifices. They contained, as in Delphi and Pergamon, 2 racetracks, a Sphaerosterion reserved for training of boxers, a Colonima for the wrestlers, and a court which allowed other exercises such as jumping. Next to the steam bath, a swimming pool opened to the swimmers. Not only did philosophers like Aristotle at the Lyceum or Antisthenes at the Cynosarges open schools there. The gymnasiums were used just as well for the teachings of poetry, of rhetoric, of grammar, of mathematics, of music. The first appearance of an exeter, a semicircular rectangular teaching space with benches at the 3 walls from which this arrangement derives, open to the 4th, in an educational establishment dates back to the beginning of the 3rd century and becomes frequent with the 2nd century. This is paralleled with the institutionalization of the teaching. The cities then granted their official patronage to the teaching which was previously given there privately. Promoted to the rank of a high school, the gymnasium then was fitted with such teaching halls, etc., and with libraries. The most impressive systematic construction made in antiquity for the promotion and fostering of philosophical research is the Museion in Alexandria. It was founded by Ptolemy Sota, who was advised by Demetrius of Phaleron, a philosopher who was taught at the Peripatos, or a disciple of Aristotle, and himself a statesman. Demetrius Phaleron was a statesman and philosopher who emigrated to Alexandria. The architecture of the museum was designed to create a scholarly community and to embody an ideal image of scientific research. The basic conviction guiding this construction is that science is realized spatially in a system of buildings. Demetrius of Phaleron thought of an architecture of science without which science cannot be done properly. So this only makes sense if not the scientists are the important thing, but the architecture is the important thing. Yeah? The museum combined building types in view of the production of knowledge. It was subdivided as on an assembly line. The first building for formal knowledge-based communication, for doctrine and disputation, called Exeter, closed again on the 3 sides by walls, with the 4th side openly towards a colonnade. Then the triclinium, a hall for the meals, was furnished with wooden ceilings supported by pillars giving view to the skies. Thirdly, a tree-lined avenue, the Peripatos, for the inner dialogue of the scholars in moving up and down along or in dialogue with each other. 4th, the library, the great famous library of Alexandria, shelves surrounded by columns and benches for reading or studying. 5th, the great hall in the library called Oikos for the meetings of all scholars. 6th, the halls for setting up scientific apparatuses like the prototype of the laboratory. And finally, the shared living and sleeping areas. The history of philosophy obviously doesn't with the closing of the antique philosophical schools. By the way, I would love, if I was ever to make a film, a documentary film or something, I would love to make a film on the year, I think it's 536, when the last philosophical school closes in Western Europe. So they close the door, put the remaining books on a donkey and move to Persia. And then for 1,000 years, nothing in Europe, no philosophy. Then of course it comes back to Spain and through the Arab teaching of philosophy, and then slowly back into what's today Europe. But I love to see that philosophy emigrates from Europe. They close the door to philosophy. I love that. So of course it doesn't stop there, but you have of course monasteries. Here again the cloister courtyard, most importantly, public libraries, the university. Here again, I could spend a lecture on this, but I've studied for some time. I wanted to write a book on the philosophy of on the architecture of science, centered on universalism and universities. What's interesting about the birth of universities, I don't know if you know this. Universities, there were predecessors in Bologna, but the first university of this name roughly is the University of Paris. How did the University of Paris come about? There were small cloistered schools, high schools in the cloisters, but there was a strike of the scholars, a strike of the students. The students were on strike. And so they left the colleges attached to the monasteries and started teaching at the crossroads in Snjezana on straw boards. And that's the birth of the university. So it's universal, not attached to a cloister anymore, but on the street crossings of Snjezana in Paris. That's the birth of the university. The first university buildings is striking students on the store boards in Paris. I love that, because it sort of could be paradigmatic for what a university should be about. Fifth, then again, lecture halls and disputation halls for most of medieval philosophy. Then anatomical theatres. I studied 5 years of my life I devoted to the study of anatomical theatres. Which is ridiculous. So again, I spare you a action on that. And laboratories and others, of course. So one could write the history of philosophy based on these teaching rooms, maybe. Second chapter of my talk today is to deconstruct the implicit assumptions. What do these architectures, these structures, do with the body of the architect and with the architectural community? If a thorough empirical study would be made of the actual sites where big philosophical advances were made, one would doubtlessly rather have to consider such places as Wittgenstein's hut in Norway, Descartes' reclusion in a small hotel in southern snowy Germany, or Heidegger's hut in the Black Forest. And yet none of these had happened had not the authors first studied philosophy and discussed their findings later in academic context and institutions. Looking back at the philosophical schools of antiquity, one can point at interesting architectural differences which have bearings to the conception of what philosophical practice is, which would be, this was what I mentioned earlier, and this is where I am today. At the academy you have a place establishing equality among the learning, a place of instruction in aristocratic and exclusive setting. It's important to know that Plato was part of the high aristocracy of Lyceum, a school in a garden centered around Harry Potter's The Column Courtyard. The Kynosages, a garden next to a sports gym. The store, an intervention in the urban center. The Kepos of Epicurus, a garden villa for the formation of a community of pleasure. In all these examples, the body of the philosopher, just as the notion of what it is to do philosophy, are thought differently. Equally, philosophizing as a group activity and the politics of the philosophical community contrast in an obvious manner. The academic body, our bodies, grow next to physical exercises in an exclusive aristocratic garden far from urban turmoil. It has ample time and is devoted to the study of canonic texts. It fits into a school hierarchy. Other philosophical schools depend upon the possibility of movement and dialogue as strolled through the garden. They might even seek to study nature there. The Stoic body is invested in urban conflicts. It needs the presence of mind to fence off the rhetorical force of concurrence in activities and schools such as the sophists. It intervenes directly into politics. The Epicurean garden party assumes the body of the philosopher to be his or her instrument on which she learns to play when interchanging pleasurable acts with like-minded people. It is necessary to add the observation that generally the two resources mentioned in the description of the schools are libraries and places for teaching, but scarcely mention is made of kitchen, of wine cellars, or of provisions for respite or sleep. The implicit assumption of all considered cases seems to be that philosophy flourishes as a book-based instruction between professor and student. But what is flourishing apart from the instruction? Philosophy certainly does not simply take place where knowledge about philosophy is taught. So instruction in itself, teaching philosophy, is not philosophy. With the exception of Stoicism and most strongly in Epicureanism, emphasis is made on the installing of a small elite group of students who should form a philosophical community. But what distinguishes a philosophical community, say, from a mystic or religious sect? Whatever it is, certainly is not a sufficient criterion for the taking place of philosophy. Architecture's relation here to philosophy seems to be that it separates and privatizes the philosophical transaction. It provides a relatively ideal setting for daytime tranquility and talk. It situates the activity in rather wealthy areas of town, with the exposition of both privacy, that means it doesn't only cater for this, but it shows this in the sense, maybe that Jörg has explained earlier, of both privacy, leisure, and intellectual distinction. It provides facilities for teaching, for talking, for writing, for strolling, and for storing, and maybe for snoring too. At a second glance, it seems striking that these aspects produce the appearance of self-sufficiency combined with the body determined by intellect. So what these do is they show the body as being determined by intellect. And they make us use our body in this sense. If one takes into account how the notion of the garden and the common hall fusion in cloister courtyards, one can see that philosophy seems to depend on running in squared circles, repeating motions with as little distraction as possible, effortless, pointless movement. The basic trait, I assume, is to set oneself off, to pompously negate physical, natural, empirical, countable competition, a demonstrative agonal stance, even when it comes to the cultivation of pleasures as a social distinction. It would be tempting now to, now at the closing of my talk, it would be tempting now to sketch an ideal building which facilitates, fosters, and promotes the kind of philosophy that I adore. Or dialectically, to think of architecture as massively negating or making philosophical practice entirely impossible. This would be a nice thought exercise to think of what architecture makes philosophy impossible. Then you will also come up with certain factors. Thirdly, one could try to sketch a concept of philosophy based on architecture. Now I'll resume what I think of what philosophy of architecture is about. It is an answer to the question, what is philosophy? And it would be an answer given by the description of where it takes place, the necessary features of its architecture. Let's try it as a project. If it is the architecture and not the institution, then we can perhaps find an answer based on spatio-temporal design features. So far we have assumed that the question what philosophy is could be answered by pointing at the work of authoritative figures and early philosophical schools. Just as thinking is not simply what renowned humans do with their brains. Philosophy could be said as depending on certain media, on specific institutionalizations in the sense of Cornelius Castoriadis, such as language, and on architecture. Why architecture? Analogous to the difference between any kind of agonal movement and sports. So there's agonal movement and sports, which is due to the existence of a stadium or any kind of other appropriate sports architecture. So if there's sports requires an architecture in order to be not mere agonal movement. One might say that what distinguishes your tinkering with a novel thought or argument and, on the other side, genuine philosophy is the existence of a discursive arena, to employ a Harmonasian stance for the ground. So just any kind of thinking and philosophy, the distinction would be a discursive arena. What are the necessary and what are the sufficient criteria for such a space? Well, the necessary criterion is that it allows for an exhibition of discourse and a battle with arguments. But this feature would generally go for parliaments, for courthouses, and perhaps also for debating clubs, poetry slams, churches, yoga ashrams, and the meeting of the anonymous alcoholics. This criterion posits philosophy as a discursive activity. It would therefore imply dialogue, a possibility to test each other's arguments, eventually recording, writing, a potential public to witness, to learn, and to act as an arbiter. What counts as philosophy, in difference to what is said in other discursive arenas, will go beyond the paradigmatic set of beliefs, which is not easily refutable and which serves, despite its eccentricity, for future conviction building. So I would say the difference of philosophy are these three features. It goes beyond the paradigmatic set of beliefs, it's not easily refutable, and it may serve, despite its eccentricity, for future belief building. At best, it demonstrates a novel schema which makes us perceive, conceive, and express the world anew and perhaps more appropriate. A corresponding sufficient criterion, so going beyond the necessary criterion, should therefore allow to distinguish a philosophical architecture in a full-blown sense, one that would mean something else than an ethical or aesthetical or politically correct architecture, from a judicial or parliamentary structure. This approach does not seem promising if one takes into account that just like the literary forms of philosophy are not fixed and evolve over time, from dialogues, letters, long poems, old tractatus to essays and aphorisms. Some would even add painting or film. The places where philosophy takes place are subject to the same forces that drive the temporal ruptures and paradigm shifts. Let's stick then for a second with Gilles Deleuze's proposal to define philosophy as the engineering of concept, he famously said, engineering of concepts. I find this convincing, yet it should be clear that this engineering has quite some presuppositions and necessary context conditions. It certainly is not to be conflated with just any pragmatistic tinkering and bricolage in one's basement hobby shop of concept. It is a collective endeavor which implies a strive for an inventive force, just as a debate about the soundness of arguments and ways of presentation. For all kinds of philosophy imaginable, a corresponding architecture cannot be easily inferred. Rather, we ought to return our attention to the basic question of the philosophy of architecture, which is how to conceive of architecture. We said architecture, when relating to this, to the beginning of what Kant has said about architectonics, we said architecture is about demonstrating a schema. What is this schema? What is architecture? Is what we expect of architecture to represent the relevant philosophy? I think this was a bit what Jörg has promoted this morning. Is it the invention of an adequate set of symbols which would make us read in front of it the key message, say, of Platonism? Is architecture to be defined as a symbol system which, through spatial arrangement of plastic elements, conveys meaning? Or should we believe that, in difference to mere building and to mere engineering, architecture fulfills functions in an aesthetic way, in a certain sense of aesthetic? Does architecture induct experiences? Either in such a way as to represent an idea, as for instance Ludger Schwarte has it, or urging us to experience reflexively, urging us to experience. Or thirdly, is architecture to be conceived of as a power machine? This would be the Foucauldian answer, a power machine that does not depend on being recognized, but is effective on the level of bodies and effective energies, eventually constructing physical effect or cyclical effects through physical arrangements, through technologies of surveillance of control. Reformulated in our context, would we expect adequate spaces of reflection to represent ideal notions of reflection or to express the philosophy in their formal language? Or would we expect a space of reflection help us experience a philosophical attitude by being aesthetically or ethically demanding? Or do we think of architecture as a machine that produces philosophers, almost unwillingly and regardless of intentions and symbols, by a discipline of walls, directions of movements, and coercion of perception? The decision between these three approaches depends on how we would realistically, I think, that is independent of our plans and intentions, describe the effect of architecture, and also on how we would like it to be, that is, on our normative concept of architecture. Would we like an architecture that makes us think, like a monument, like a memorial, which ideally forces all future generations to remember, or a thought-provoking monument that leaves us no chance but to reflect? Or would we like an architecture that invites us to some form of cosmopolitan exchange, like a table with food and wine? Both options, I think, don't correspond. The one because we are addressed as subjects, our thoughts would not be our own thoughts. And in the second case, the conversations would well be pleasurable, but mere philosophical gossip or learned quotations. Furthermore, architecture can itself be dull or intelligent. Some speak even of smart architecture as soon as digital processing is involved. But even an architecture that speaks to the highest intelligence, or one that is in itself a device of utmost cunning, able to learn, to remember, to invent, would not be more apt to making us reflect than the combination of a clear night sky and a well, or a bomb living in a tub on a public square. I would not be satisfied with an architecture that mainly represents, nor with one that forces me to behave, to perceive or think in a certain way. Both options could be called didactical. between these two options, I think there's a third one that I would try to advocate. My proposal would be to think of architecture as a public resource, as a structure that enables, in German I would say ermöglichen, that enables that which makes collective action possible. Architecture, as I see it, is basically a way through which we come up, not with functioning realities, but with new possibilities that comes up with affordances. They are not necessarily given. Architecture means, literally, if you think of what architecture means, it means arche and timeline. It means building a beginning. A philosophical architecture would be that makes this evident. So a philosophical architecture would be one that makes ordinary architecture evident in such a way that we are brought to reflect architecturally. To sum up, we would have to invent a philosophical architecture that makes this evident. In our case, this would mean that we have to invent an architecture that helps us to liberate thought, that makes us aware of ourselves, aware of what it means to be on Earth, on how delicate and worthwhile human relations are, and how to develop friendly relations to all kinds of other beings. It makes us understand the presuppositions, foundations, and possibilities of our existence, and it makes us lay the foundations of our existence in thinking, in sides of reflection. Thanks for listening. Thank you for
Thank you. Very, very interesting, exciting talk. So probably you prepare your thinking about the questions, but until you prepare your probably just very short my question. You suggest to us, it's extremely interesting your research, the relation between the architectural structure and the social act. So you suggest that we have the different social acts, different social events, let us say, different areas of social life, corresponds with a different architectural structure. You also suggest to us that we have a different philosophy. Also, you mentioned some Greeks examples, different philosophies, different areas, different spaces of reflections. You now said, and I like very much that you plead for some kind of normative philosophy of architecture, and you suggest to us that we need to think about the new spaces of reflection, new structure, new architectural structure. Does it mean that you think that we need some new philosophy? Because different philosophy, different spaces, and we have the hedonism, stoicism, the Platonian academy, Aristotelian peripatetic school, the different spaces. Now you suggest that we need some very specific structure. We need the architectural structure. Do you have some specific kind of philosophy on your mind? So I'm just interested in which kind of philosophy you have on your mind. You suggested that it could be some cosmopolitan exchange of ideas, but
Well,
you mentioned.
Yeah, this is the philosophy I had in mind. What I meant in introducing is that for me, philosophy of architecture is not only a transdiscipline, but also a philosophical stance that I try to develop. And when I was summing up, as you mentioned, what I try to do is to first sort of realistically describe the effect of architecture. So what architecture does, independent of programs, plans, and intentions. So while the history of architecture, when it's practiced by historians of art, often mainly refers to the intentions of the planners, of the architects. My stance would be realistic in the sense that I would look what the architecture actually did and what it came up with. So for instance, when studying the architecture of 18th century Paris, I looked not what the architects meant to do there, but how it could be served, how it served in a different way as a prerequisite for the revolution. So it could be turned around, but the revolution could not be done without the architecture. Thereby, my analysis was that it was no causal relation. The architecture did not cause the revolution in this sense. Also, the gymnasium does not cause the emergence of philosophy, but philosophy would also not have existed, would not have come about without architecture, certain architectural structures. And yet, what I call the architecture is not what the architects intended, but some realistically described effect of this structure. Whatever the structure means, also including agents, animals, maybe plants, etc. Not only brick and stone and glass. So, and this then leads me to what you said, the normative stance, which is that to say it again, if this is true, if human existence, for instance, depends very much on architecture, just as the beaver's life depends, the life form of the beaver depends on the beavers building dams, or the birds need to build nests. Then we must think differently of what architecture means, and I come back to analysis of what architecture means, which has normative implications, which would mean that we don't want structures, we want to build structures that don't cause us to behave in a certain way, perceive in a certain way, to dominate what we think, but to set us free, to be just a beginning, a possibility with which we can do things or leave it. And that entails, of course, a different notion of action, of liberation, etc. So there's a normative stance that and a specific philosophy that I try to develop under the name of philosophy of architecture.
Thank you. So please.
I have this, maybe it's a wrong impression. You mean as there's one philosophy, a universal idea of philosophy. The philosophy of the ancient time is an exercise of life, a living style. And then, in medieval age, philosopher began a professor, the professionalization of philosophy, the institutionalization. And we are being already, how do you say, the heritage of this history. And so, this means that philosophy is not simply a discipline that helps us to liberate thought. It's a science, it's his own language, his own tools, and technique, and it's hard to me to separate the political meaning of the philosophical practice. So, political. It's a practice, yeah. And it's a political meaning. And I think it's a little bit dangerous to emphasize the idea of philosophy as, because it depends on what in the ancient was thinking about philosophy, and we are in other history. So I don't know.
Yeah. I hope I have mentioned the fact that I know that history has come up with many different versions of philosophy. But I think as philosophers, we are not forced to stop there. But we can ask again, okay, when thinking today, what is important in this history? And what is my presupposition, what is my usage of this term philosophy? How do I want to use it? What did I understand as being the core of philosophy? It has descriptive and normative implications. So for instance, you also used, even though you reminded me of the historical differences, but even if you remind me of the historical differences, you yourself employ certain notion of philosophy. So when you say this is a different version of philosophy than that, then you have a notion that englobes the two, right? And so what I did here is I started with a general and school-like version of let's start with the beginning with ancient Greece, and I think I mentioned the fact that there's different versions and that also the break in medieval times has come up with a different story, etc. But what I wanted to underline mainly of this story was that one could now step back again and ask, so what is philosophy? That's what I did with Gilles Deleuze. So the most intelligent answer of contemporary philosophy to what philosophy is, if you just don't want to stick with telling the history of philosophy again with the different versions, if you want to answer what is philosophy, the most intelligent answer I know of is this answer from Gilles Deleuze, engineering of concepts. Okay, but then what does engineering concept mean? That's what I wanted to add to Deleuze. Because 20th century's obsession with language has led philosophers to answer the question of engineering of concepts with sticking only to a language exercise. And much of 20th century philosophy, as you know, was a language exercise very close to philology, sometimes even boringly close to philology. And what you reminded me is that, of course, it's a political thing, and that's what I wanted to underline here too. That the fact that not only it's institutionalized, also already in antiquity, but it situates itself in a certain relation to the city, to politics, etc., makes the political philosophy of Plato be different than the one of the Stoics. You mentioned cosmopolitanism. Stoic philosophy is so important as it invented cosmopolitanism, and not by chance, because it was the one philosophy in close contact to democracy, and is apparently the one philosophy that has a political philosophy positive of democracy, speaking positively of democracy. We have only fragments of it. It has been destroyed for obvious reasons. But the other versions, of course, are aristocratic political philosophies that destroy philosophy, destroy democracy. Only Stoicism is in favor of democracy, not by chance, because it was in the middle of the city. And in order to come up with an intelligent answer, I would say to consider the architectural disposition within which this philosophy flourished means to separate it from persons, means to separate it tangentially also from language, from concepts and dialogue, to how it takes place, how it materializes itself in relation to and not independent from architectural structures. That was my endeavor today. So I'm aware of the historical differences, I'm aware that today we are at a different position. But what I think now today is how would I like to conceive of philosophy, of philosophical practice. Then exactly what you remind me of comes back into play, that I don't want to come up with a concept of philosophy that forgets these two things. Firstly, it's a communal activity. It has to do with forming a community. And this sort of ideal community that philosophy always wanted to be has a relation to, has bearings on situating philosophy in the context of politics or human life in general. And so what we think philosophy does has to answer to these two questions too. So I think we both agree on this.
So we have 3 questions from Priya, Hannah, and then you. Sorry.
Goes into the direction how far would you stretch the concept of architecture? Because as I understood you, or what you just said, it's about a communal activity. So then space is part of the communal activity, but there are so many things adding to it. So if you look at this room, we have space, but we have also the way we are sitting here, a way that we know conference or seminars going on, so we raise our hands when we talk, or so there are so many things that come from a collective knowledge or a collective experience. And would you put that also in the term of architecture? I mean, I think it's possible that would then really stretch architecture into something that is, there's only one part that is material, but there are many layers that wouldn't be material anymore, but just ways on how we behave or activities that we score, or maybe something like an event design. And, yes. So.
Yeah. The answer is yes.
Right.
So first of all, as I said, I wouldn't restrict the concept of architecture to the profession of architects since Vitruvius. Right? It's interesting to read Vitruvius and to consider everything that modern architects have done, also in relation to philosophy, etc. But if you want to analyze what we do here now, your possibility of addressing this question to be my possibility of answering. If you want to come up with a coherent and convincing account of how this is possible and how it is architecturally possible. So how, in which way architecture influences our possibility to ask these questions to each other. Then we cannot restrict the answer to whatever the architect did want to do. You also cannot restrict the answer to saying there's a table and a chair, because what is a table and a chair? This would restrict architecture to fulfilling functions, but these functions would be thought of as given. That's sort of the implicit criticism to this anthropological approach that Jörg has sketched before. It's not necessarily a criticism, it depends on how he understands anthropology. But 20th century anthropology has very much assumed that there's a given set of needs to which then functions can cater. But if you think of emergence, so if this is contingent, then what a table does is not given by handwriting or sitting, etc. So the functions are not given. And so a starting point would be to think of architecture in terms of actor network theory, but going beyond, of course. Because the answer to what materials do and also what humans do as architects, as a collective, is Latour has a tendentially aristocratic or hero-centered account. There's Pasteur who does certain things, right? And because of him, then certain things are possible for liquids and for microbes to do. But if you think it's rather on the plane, then you don't have these heroes. And this would mean that to go, just to give a short answer, to go beyond actor network theory. But as a starting point, actor network theory would be my way of approaching the architectural setting. Is that a sketch of an answer? Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that with this concept of inventing an architecture which could direct human behavior or the development of intellectual abilities, you've actually anticipated my topic, and the fact that many of the things you listed have actually been scientifically researched and proven. So I can already try to give you an answer to an architecture that would help liberate thought. So research has shown that higher ceilings actually help liberate thought because they encourage creative and lateral thinking. And this is both intuitive and evolutionary, because if we do not feel restrained by spaces, then we feel freer, more comfortable, and more ready to engage in abstract thinking. This is also the reason why, for example, surgical halls have lower ceilings, because the lower your ceiling, the more you're focused on what is in front of you, what's detailed and what's very concrete. But what I wanted to know is, since this is all very intuitive, what sort of space would you imagine to understand the presuppositions, foundations, and possibilities of our existence?
So this was too quick acoustically.
The second to last line in your presentation. Was it? No, the last slide. This presuppositions, foundations, possibilities. I mean, just intuitively. What sort of space would do, what sort of spatial settings or features could encourage that sort of even sort of these feelings of resonance?
What I meant by this line is, well, sorry if this sounds stupid that I write these things. What I meant by this is that, in addition to what I just said, if we understand in which way interaction can have architectural barriers, then there can be an architecture that makes us understand in which way our not professional architects' actions change the presuppositions of our existence. So maybe this is too complicated fashion. If you think of Hannah Arendt has the concept of action, which is interesting, which led me to this kind of thinking on architecture. Her concept of action thinks very much in interaction. She says every action is a starting and then causes dialogue. And if you think that some of these actions have structural bearings, so bring about a change in the human landscape that make other forms of interaction, other forms of community building possible, then there can be an architecture that makes us understand this. Yeah, let's give you a stupid example would be a modular Bauhaus villa that makes you because of its modularity, think of how do I want to live, with whom do I want to share a wall, with whom do I want to go to space. It invites you to think of how do I think of
how human agency sort of forms spaces at the very spot by through their interaction and the way they choose to distribute their space. No, that makes plenty of sense.
Architecture interferes, I can't really hear you.
No, I just said this makes plenty of sense. Thank you.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Okay, so we had 3 questions and then we need to finish. So the first is yours, then Matea, and then your for the end.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. I was wondering if I understood you right. You seem to be very keen to make a difference between architecture as a space of action and architecture as a space of representation, as understood by the architecture parlante. The second one, thinking about the high ceilings or the term, I don't know how to translate it in English, Ausdruck, what impression it makes on our experience. And I was wondering if your point is that this relation is not linear, like the experience is caused by architecture or architecture causes experience, but that architecture can be understood in form of a prefiguration of experience, so let's say experience emerges from architecture, is being changed or structured by it, and it returns to architecture again. So I'm trying to get your point. It's not only these 2 opposites, but it's the interchange system between them. The foundation of our experience lays in architecture, is being structured through it, and goes back to architecture. Is it right?
Yeah, but it very much depends on how you interpret your last 2 sentences. Because there's 2 options. The one would be you are able to infer from an architecture that you see the kind of meaning of architecture. There would be reading architecture, even though it might not be working as an architectural parlante or symbol-based architecture. The other one would be the one following from your argument. If I have a scientific study of how architecture influences or even stronger causes me to think in a certain way. So if, for instance, I have scientific knowledge of how to program architecturally what people experience in it, think in it. I mean, that would be thinking of architecture as a machine that produces philosophers. But that's what would not be corresponding to my idea of philosophy as having to do with free thought. It wouldn't be my thoughts that I think, but that would be the architect's thoughts, or whoever was engaging or asking the architect to program with high ceilings by having high thoughts. I mean, it would not be my philosophy, right, that would emerge in this building. So I would not be happy with the conceiving of architecture, with this notion of architecture as either representing, nor with causing me to behave or think in a certain way. This might not have been possible, but this recent scientific study maybe becomes possible, that you build spaces that force me to think in a certain way. This would be a horror sort of, or very Foucauldian sort of what architecture does. And I think there's a third option, a third way, which would also be more corresponding to the very term and the concept of architecture, which lays the foundation, a possibility, a beginning, but not forces you to, it doesn't produce you. It doesn't, so structure there doesn't make you behave in a certain way, but gives you an affordance. It transforms matter in a certain way such that something practical can be done, but it doesn't force you to do so. So it opens the space for free interaction.
Yeah.
And then you're short, if possible, because we are out of time.
I have 2 short questions. Thank you for your lecture. I would like to ask if you can maybe elaborate a little bit on your definition of architecture as a public resource, because in a way I think it's really bold to have a definition, right? Then to say architecture is this and that, as well, in my opinion, every philosophy of architecture should start from the questioning of what is architecture. And when you are already big in the an answer is this is really hard to find in philosophy in a way. And if you could just clarify a little bit more what you mean with this public resource, and maybe also how does this public resource, as architecture meaning of public resource, how does this influence contemporary society? Does it, or in which way? Very important question. I will not.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So, short answer. The question was, can I elaborate, but in a short way. Yeah, well, of course, I would say that's the task of philosophy, to come up, to engineer concepts. And I'm not content with any philosophy of architecture worthy of that name if it doesn't spell out what it understands among this term. So, if you just describe the practice of architects, fine, but that's not what I would say is a philosophy of architecture. So, if I give you my answer, or this is my approach, this is my offering. And public resource here means is exactly what I've tried to catch again. It's not a causal relation, but it's a resource, and it has to do with the German term Möglichkeit, ermöglichen. So for me, architecture, what it does is ermöglichen, rendering possible, coming up with a new possibility, seeing that there's not a given set of possibilities established over time, but it depends on architecture to come up with something like this as a practical or conceptual resource. So this maybe it's also, this is a short answer, long answer you find in my book. Okay. The second answer, what does it have to do with contemporary society? Here I try again, a short answer. Why do I do philosophy of architecture? Because all these things are not once and for all given, but historically contingent. So for instance, referring to what we discussed, that philosophy exists is historically contingent. It has a clear historical address. It emerges in the 5th century before Christ, and not before, not anywhere else. It doesn't emerge in Australia. Okay, there are similar forms, but what we call philosophy doesn't emerge in Australia 500 before Christ, but in essence. Just like art. It's fine that similar forms to art emerge somewhere, but what we call art has a clear historical address, and it is contingent. It depends on certain infrastructures, amongst them architectures. And what I mean by that is that it can also vanish. What I am most concerned with in my book are public spaces, because they can be called resources for free interaction. And they are everything but obvious. You know, if you look like of the history of public squares, for instance, it's not something you find in just any mass agglomeration across history. But to find architectural dispositions that allow something like a public to convene is historically scarce. It's not often the case. In cultural history, so to speak, to have such a thing as a public space. And therefore, it has many bearings on contemporary society. If there is architecture, if there is a public resource. And of course, with public, it has many political implications. It does not mean communal, doesn't mean this people, it does not mean das Volk, and it does not mean mine, and you have to buy it. Okay?
Thank you. Finally, your please.
Okay, thank you, Ludger. This was very interesting, and I think you also raised very central issues for our discussion. We will keep discussing these things. But just maybe some comments. So you are thinking about a non-causal relation between architecture and philosophy. Well, that's very interesting, but still I think architecture is always there. There is a relation. But to reduce it somehow to a non-causal relation, which at the same time it has an effect, that's very interesting. But I did not exactly understand why you insisted on the affordance so much, because affordance is the same kind of authoritarian thing, very much in the terms of, in the sense of nature somehow of the actor network theory. So people things have that kind of power on ourselves. So I wasn't so sure about this affordance. And I was also not so sure, a little bit you brought it down, architecture is that thing which you read. But probably that's not only a reading of architecture. Of course, when we will talk about these things, there's a kind of immanence, I don't know, architecture, so that that works on the body and on the mind, not in the sense of reading and science introduce it as a part of it. And it's interesting, so you can also go back to history. For example, Alberti criticizes Vitruv very much for the idea of how, what was first, how architecture came about. So Vitruv tells the story. There was these people in the woods that came together, gathered around a fire, and while they are around the fire, because the fire is okay, so they survive, so they develop language, and then they have language, and then at a certain moment they start to do buildings, because it's like the fire buildings are nice, you survive better and you have a better life. Now Alberti, in a very short passage, he says, well, if he thinks about what walls brought about in society, he thinks there were first the walls, and the walls are a precondition for society. Just the other way around. He said, no, we need architecture, and architecture creates society, and architecture creates and also philosophy. I found this very interesting, that you are in a line of thinking architecture which starts with Renaissance, with actually with Alberti, but it's only 2 or 3 lines in his book, but he criticizes Vitruv, and actually he's the first who brings up this idea of the relation or correlation between thinking, society, and walls and architecture, maybe also philosophy. And then maybe just I think there is architecture which may have this kind of effect, this liberating effect, which thought causing, which all your criteria. I think it was your last slide. And I think throughout history there are different kinds of architecture. Palladio, I think, if you go during the Palladio period, you have this, it's liberating, it's like thought-provoking, it puts yourself into question and you start to think about your life right in the middle of your vacation, you start. Or for example, in modern times, maybe Mies van der Rohe is this kind of architecture. So of course you're still dealing with architecture, with all what architecture is about. It has to do with science, it has to do with metaphors and these kind of things. And maybe it has to do with how you avoid certain effects of architecture, classical or conventional effects, and how you trigger other effects, but still through material, through space. And I think the question, maybe one more remark, Nietzsche hoped for this kind of spaces. So Teresa wrote a very nice final paper in the seminar on architecture and philosophy, where she elaborates a little bit on this and what it means. That he felt that we need spaces where we can walk in ourselves and develop our thoughts. And this was clearly, after the end of God, it's not in the churches, cloisters. But he was looking for new spaces, and he found these spaces in Torino, in the arcades of Turin. It's also, this is a kind of very interesting, where he thought that architecture enhances somehow the thinking. It also helps to overcome a certain kind of thinking and enhances a certain thinking. Maybe Teresa can talk a little bit about this whenever it was your thing. You think it's possible?
Yeah, I think I will present it actually.
Okay, perfect. All right. Yes.
So,
Just as some kind of thoughts.
thank you. We have some need, to comment your comments.
No, just say thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah. So thank you, Ludger, and thank you all of you. Yeah, thank you.